In this video, I'll show you how to install the bulkheads on your X4. The bulkheads are quite different to the ones on the T4. We have a new feature, which are the pins, which hold the bulkheads in place on the chassis. So this makes the installation of the bulkheads a lot easier because they're kept centered by these pins. But I'm still gonna utilize the bulkhead alignment tool, the 19mm bulkhead alignment tool from Hoodie, to put these in place, just to make sure that they're perfectly straight on the chassis. So what we do is put the bulkheads on the chassis into the slots for those little pins. Then put the bulkhead alignment tool in there. And we put the screws in there, but we don't tighten them down just yet. We're just gonna put them in there to line everything up before we tighten them down. And finally, the fourth screw. When they're all lined up here, we have the bulkhead alignment tool installed in between the bulkheads, and we can tighten everything down. And when that is done, you should be able to easily take the bulkhead alignment tool out, and the bulkheads are lined up perfectly straight on the chassis. Repeat the same process for the rear. As I said, with the new pins which are featured on the X4, it's a lot easier to make sure that the bulkheads are straight. It also gives you added rigidity to the assembly of the car, and yeah. So I'm going to continue the build of bag number 3, which is the motor mounts and so on. We're first going to put these rear bulkheads in place in the same way that I put the front ones on. Put these in here, and then we're gonna once again utilize the bulkhead alignment tool from Hoodie, which you slide in here to make sure that the bulkheads are perfectly aligned. That's done, and we're gonna move on to the next parts of the drivetrain. Before we put the motor mount in place, we're going to have to assemble the lay shaft, which is also new on the X4 because the pulley now is one piece. It's no longer split in two. So we have the pulley all on one side and the spur gear on the other side. So how do we fixate the pulley onto the lay shaft? We use a small O-ring, which we just put here on the outside. This O-ring is usually enough to keep this in place. It works for most conditions. but in some extreme conditions you can use snap ring here. But I recommend using the O-ring for most conditions. Spur gear, that's included in the kit, is a 110 tooth spur gear. You need to keep in mind the offset here of the spur gear needs to go towards the right side of the car. So we put the spur gear on here. And we use the specifically made steel screws with a small head to put the spur gear in place. Tighten these down. And as you can see, the offset of the spur gear is pointing towards the right side. This is very important. And before we put this onto the motor mount, we have a small shim which goes onto the lay shaft before we put this on there. Make sure you choose the right bearings for this lay shaft assembly. These are now removable, so you can easily remove these bearings to maintain the lay shaft. Just push this in place here. So even though these bearings are new, I still prefer to add a drop of Hoodie bearing oil into the bearings before driving the car, to make sure that these bearings have a longer life and less wear, just to reduce wear and friction. Okay, it's done. What I do then is I put this motor mount here onto the car. Again, the motor mount is just like the bulkheads, it's pinned into the chassis, so we have small pins to keep this motor mount lined up, to keep it straight. So it's very easy to put it onto the chassis, just put it on there and tighten these screws down. And as I said, it's pinned, so you don't really need to pay attention to the straightness of this. We're not going to tighten it down just yet because we have to install the spur gear first. We just put these screws in there. I then install the belts on the pulley. The belt goes to the right, goes to the front solid axle, and the rear belt goes on the left side of the pulley. Push this on here. And that's installed. And finally we're gonna install a screw to keep the lay shaft in place here. And make sure that it's moving freely. That's all done. We can then proceed to tighten down these screws in the bottom of the motor mount. When you install a 110 tooth spur gear, you need to loosen the motor mount to fit the spur gear. But if you use a smaller spur gear, such as 100 or a smaller spur gear, you can easily remove the spur gear just with the 3 screws without having to even loosen the motor mount. So that's a very big improvement in the ease of maintenance of the X4. We're then gonna install our solid axle and our diff. Put the bearings in here. We also offer these eccentric bearing holders in aluminum material. So these are a great option for competition because you have a freer drivetrain with less friction, and it will definitely make a difference in stock classes, especially. But for this build here, we're gonna use the kit plastic eccentric holders. So we put these on here for the front solid axle. Make sure that you put the solid axle in the right direction, so then the short side of the solid axle towards the right side of the car and the long side towards the left side. The shape of the solid axle has been changed a little bit, so the belt is now more towards the center line of the car, but you still have to pay attention to the direction of the car, of the solid axle when you install it. Okay, that's there. Now I'm gonna proceed to install the upper arms on the car. So as you can see here, we have these little aluminum caster inserts, which I'm gonna talk about in the caster tech tip, but for now I'm just gonna install these in the upper arms, in the upper bulkheads. And we have the inserts installed. Now it's very important that we install these 8mm steel screws to hold these inserts down. I recommend using the included steel screws because they'll give you the best durability, and most of all, these will not come loose while driving. It's important to not use these screws in an aluminum material or titanium, because they can actually bend. I really recommend just to use these screws in a steel material and nothing else. Put these in here. And when these are all done, we're gonna put them here on the bulkheads. I'm gonna use 8mm long screws. The upper bulkheads are pinned into the lower bulkheads, which keeps this assembly completely lined up for the sake of a more consistent caster setting. This is very nicely designed, so you just have to put these in here, tighten them down. You don't need to worry about it being straight because of these included little lugs in the upper arms, which is a very nice feature. And we install the front upper bulkheads as well. That's all done. The belts that I have installed on the car are the kit belts, but we also offer the optional low friction belts, the white ones, which are really great for competition racing, mainly for stock racing, to have the freest possible drivetrain. And these belts are great. They last a bit longer than the kit belts as well, so they're highly recommended. And finally, we're gonna install the belt tensioners, which is a new feature as well on the X4. We have two belt tensioners on the motor mount in the center of the car. And this is a really nice feature because it gives you more options to set the belt tension. So when you put these belt tensioners together here, we need to pay attention to the shimming. You need to use these bearings. That's what they look like. And these parts have to go in a specific order here, as you can see in the manual. To make sure that we have the right size of shims here. Those go there for the front bulkheads. We have these nuts, we have the bearings. We have these really long countersunk screws, which hold these together. And then we have two 4mm shims for the front belt tensioner. And for the rear center belt tensioner, we have a 7mm shim on the outside of the bearing and a 1mm shim on the inside. And we're gonna put all of this together on the one screw. Put the shims in the correct order and we install it here onto the car. And then for the front, again, pay attention to the order of the parts. 4mm shim, bearing, another 4mm shim, and the nuts. And we install this like this. And that's it. We have the two additional belt tensioners installed on the center of the motor mount. And I'm going to continue to put the rest of the parts from bag number 3 onto the car. You can start with the rear shock tower, which has this shape. You put this in place with 6mm steel screws. goes in place just like that with 2 screws, very neatly. For the front, we have these new shock towers. When you install these, it's important to install the little shim, the 3mm shim that goes between the shock tower and the bulkhead. So we use this long screw, install it, put a shim on there, and then put it in place. And then we can put it in place and when it's there, we're just gonna tighten this long screw a little bit. Don't tighten it completely because we still need to install the screws from the bottom of the chassis. But we're then gonna use this long screw for the other side. And 3mm shim between the bulkhead and screws. Just repeat the same procedure as on the left side. Don't tighten it all the way, wait for these other screws to go into the chassis from the bottom. Okay, so when these screws are all in place here, you can tighten them down. So all the 4 screws, tighten them completely. And then the last step is to tighten the screws from the side. And that's it. The shock towers are in place.